I think it's important to realize, first of all, that the reason there's a conflict is because, not only in that part of the world, but there are conflicts in other parts of the world, is because there was a time where white people in Europe thought that they could control countries of other people who were not white, divide them, take them, give them to others. They had the right to do this. And we often hear of the Balfour Declaration. In Israel, basically the Zionists talk about the Balfour Declaration as though it came down from Mount Sinai with Moses, as though it is one of the 10 Commandments. The Balfour Declaration. One white racist promising another white racist somebody else's land. That's what the Balfour Declaration is all about. Lord Balfour promised his friend Lord Rothschild Palestine for the Jewish people. Who cares? Who is he to give anything to anybody? But this is what it was. And even in, almost every street in Israel has a Balfour Street or a Balfour Declaration Plaza. And then moving forward a few decades, we had the United Nations resolution to partition Palestine. Who is the United Nations to partition Palestine? But it was said that the Jews want Palestine, and it was said that the Arabs want Palestine, so we partition Palestine, and everything will be fine. And this is a map of the partition plan. And as the map very clearly illustrates, the partition was not done in a very fair way. One part is clearly larger than the other. Now, in 1947, when the partition plan was passed, there were about 500,000. The Jewish population in Palestine numbered about 500,000 people. This was the generation of my grandparents who immigrated there, and my parents who were born there. Some 500,000 people who made up the entire Jewish community in Palestine. The Palestinians, the natives of the land, were about 3 times as many, close to 1.5 million people. Yet, the United Nations, in its infinite wisdom, decided to give the larger portion of the country to the smaller community. And it's interesting because to this day we hear people say, this is really all the Palestinians' fault, because they rejected the partition plan. Well, first of all, nobody asked them. So it's not like they had an opportunity to reject. But can you imagine not rejecting it? That the United Nations would come and slice off the larger portion of your country and give it to a community of immigrants, really, who just came off the boat. And somehow everybody thought, or maybe they didn't think, but the assumption was that maybe this would work just fine, that everything would be just fine. Now, another reason this is such an important point, the partition plan, is from that moment on is when we have these two opposing stories, these two diametrically opposed histories that have emerged. And when people look for balance, perhaps you can find balance if the differences are small, if the differences are in small details or maybe a date here and there. But when the stories are diametrically opposed, that means only one can be true. There is no room for balance when you have two stories that are completely the opposite of each other. Now, the story that I grew up on as an Israeli, and the story that is basically accepted in the West, is that after the Arabs rejected the partition plan, they began an attack against the Jewish community in Palestine in an attempt to kill and destroy the Jews and destroy this small community that they created. Thankfully, the Jewish community was stronger somehow. They were more advanced, they were more developed, they were quick on their feet, and they were able to defeat the Arabs. And remember, these Zionists, this Jewish community, they claim to be the descendants of King David, who defeated Goliath, and the descendants of the Maccabees, who defeated great empires, and basically the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, who were, were always victorious against all odds. And now here they were, and they defeated the Arabs. And they established a Jewish state once again in the land of Israel after 2,000 years. Well, this is almost a biblical story. How can you refute this? How can you argue with such a romantic, like I said, almost biblical story? Who would dare say that this is not true? And it's such a powerful story too. The problem, of course, comes up when we start looking at the details. So the two communities, even though one was much smaller than the other, were both expecting to and were hoping to be recognized as states. And they began investing in developing institutions of state. But there was one thing that the Zionists, the Jewish community in Palestine, developed that the Palestinians never did. And that's an armed militia, a fighting force. By 1947, the Zionist militia in Palestine numbered close to 40,000 armed, well-trained, highly motivated men. My father was an officer in that militia. Well, there was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no Palestinian armed force. There never has been, actually, a Palestinian army. So if there was no Palestinian armed militia, who were these Arabs that attacked the Jewish community? Now, we know that other Arab countries intervened in Palestine some 6, 7, 8 months later. But at the end of 1947, who were these Arabs that attacked, and what did they attack with, if there was no fighting force? And Israeli historians have been looking at this, actually, and over the last 15, 20 years or so, they've been writing about this, answering this question, and they've been actually validating what Palestinians have said all along. It was not the Palestinians that began an assault at all. As soon as the United Nations gave its stamp to the creation of a Jewish state, or the Jewish state, in Palestine, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign that today can only be categorized as terrorism and ethnic cleansing. It was a massive campaign of an armed militia against an unarmed civilian population that lasted for 12 months, with a clear intention of completing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It was a brutal terrorist attack that lasted 12 months, at the end of which almost 80% of the country was conquered. Hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns and villages were destroyed, including mosques and churches and schools and, of course, homes. And somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. So it turns out it wasn't such a romantic, heroic story after all. It was a brutal act of terrorism, but now we can see that the pieces fit the puzzle. And again, Palestinians have been claiming this for decades. Israeli historians have validated this over the last 20 or so years with people like Ilan Pappé and others. Now, one of the claims that's made quite often by the Zionists is, well, perhaps a few villages were destroyed, perhaps a few Palestinians were forced to leave, but really